Well, since February, the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews has given $23 million in emergency relief to Ukrainians. Yael Eckstein was on the ground just 4 days before Russia invaded. It was an attack, she says, that no one in Ukraine believed would happen.
Yael Eckstein is the president of the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, based in Jerusalem. Since Russian forces first invaded Ukraine in February, the fellowship has aided more than 80,000 Ukrainians and refugees and donated 100 tons of food and medicine. Yael says their work in Ukraine is one part of the fellowship's mission to protect and preserve innocent life.
Well, please welcome back to the 700 Club, Yael Eckstein. Yael, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's my honor. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Well, you were in Kyiv just 4 days before Russia invaded. Were the Ukrainians there even prepared for what was about to happen?
Well, I think that's what really stood out to me when I went on the ground to see what was happening as 100,000 Russian troops were surrounding Ukraine. The International Fellowship of Christians and Jews has been active in providing basic needs to the Jewish community inside of Ukraine for close to 40 years. So I wanted to see how prepared they were. And what I saw was terrifying because the truth is everyone was in denial. They said, this is 2022. What, tanks are just going to come rolling into Kiev? And in my mind, I thought, yeah, it's possible. And that's when the fellowship jumped into action, thanks to our hundreds of thousands of Christian donors across America, to say, we're going to give you a grant to prepare for emergency of dry goods, foods, medicine, and mattresses. And that's really what enabled them to survive that first week of war.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, how desperate is the situation in Ukraine right now?
It's terrifying because the rest of the world is facing a crisis of rising prices, inflation, and hard to get certain items, basic items, to across the world to different countries. And what we're seeing in Ukraine is that emergency situation is just blown out of proportion. The prices are so high. There's limited fuel, there's limited food products. And what everyone's talking about right now is that the winter is approaching. And if on a regular basis, there were so many elderly Holocaust survivors who died from the cold and from hunger, this year it's going to be so much more.
Well, what sort of relief has the fellowship provided during the past 6 months?
Well, our focus is really the Jewish community in Ukraine and across the former Soviet Union, those who have survived the Holocaust, that we come and we say, the times have changed. There are millions of Christians who love you, who are sowing into you, taking the little they have to make sure that you have food and comfort. During the winter months, we make sure that we bring chopped wood because they don't even have heaters or electricity. They have a well in their backyard. And so we have volunteers that go and bring up water, make sure they're set for the entire winter. And so it's both this message of hope and faith that the times have changed, that the Holocaust survivors, we know that over 70% of Nazis identified themselves as Christians. Now, we know, anyone watching this knows that they weren't Christians, as many would say. They didn't act Christ-like, so they weren't Christians. But these Holocaust survivors don't know this, as they're living isolated, poverty-struck lives in their final years. So the fellowship comes to say it's not just this food and medicine and heat that's going to help you survive, but it's the spiritual message, the message for their heart and soul. You are not alone. For the first time in history, the Jewish people have friends.
That's so beautiful, and I'm so glad that you guys are doing that. Well, another issue that's going on in Ukraine right now is the issue of orphans. How many orphans are suffering in Ukraine, and what is being done to help them?
That's a great point. In Ukraine, in a lot of places around the world, you don't necessarily have so many orphans. In Ukraine and across the former Soviet Union, because of the poverty and because so many children are born into single mothers, out of wedlock, drugs or prostitution, horrible situations, there are so many orphanages across Ukraine. And so our focus, again, is on those Jewish orphans. And so what the fellowship did, as soon as the war broke out, our priority was on making sure the orphans were safe. And I had many sleepless nights tracking hundreds of orphans from an orphanage, for example, in Zhytomyr, Ukraine, where we've been sponsoring for over 20 years that orphanage. I've been there. And we throughout the night. We're having them switch buses and going to a certain border. The last mile, they had to walk on foot because it was so dangerous and the borders were closed. They weren't able to get through. And then the most amazing thing was that I was there in Israel as they stepped off the plane that the fellowship sponsored to hold them, to kiss them, to tell them everything will be okay. So our priority was really on getting the orphans from these orphanages out of the war zone, out of the fighting areas. And now it's really figuring out, they're starting their school year outside of Ukraine, many of them, and many of them in Ukraine. So making sure that we are not abandoning, forgetting, or neglecting even one of them, even if they physically had to change their location.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Yael, last question. Do you see any hopeful signs in the months ahead? And what would be your suggestion of how we can pray for our brothers and sisters, and especially our Jewish brothers and sisters in Ukraine?
I always see bright days ahead. I always see hope. I'm a woman of faith, and I believe that, as we say in Hebrew, Yeshua Tashem keheref ayin, redemption from the Lord can come in the blink of an eye. Just as I was in Ukraine on the ground and everything seemed normal, and 4 days later, war broke out and Kiev was almost conquered, I believe just as quickly, God can turn it around and bring peace, not only to Ukraine and Russia, but to Israel and to America and to North and South Korea and to China and everywhere in the world. So I do see bright days ahead. And I believe it's on us to believe that they can happen, to pray that they will happen. And that's what I believe God is waiting for. So my prayers these days are exactly what I said, that God will shine his light, that we will each be a light, bring light to others. And especially for the Jewish community who's running now for the second time for their lives, many of them, after the Holocaust, the love and support and prayers of the Christian community, I don't think has ever been so important.
Wow. Well, Yael, thank you so much for being with us today. And for more information on the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews and how you can help, all you have to do is just go to cbn.com. Yael, God bless you in all of your efforts.
Thank you so much.
Of course.